those of you who are familiar with the format of Sesay Says So, I usually start off my podcast by introducing a biological topic that the episode will be dedicated to. But this time I would like to do something different. Unless you have been living under a rock, you will know that the world has been set aflame by the back-to-back incidences of racial injustice specifically aimed towards black people. Unfortunately, this does not surprise me. Although it may not always be in the forefront of my mind, I am always constantly thinking about my race and how it may affect my daily interactions with people. For the past week, I have been wrapping my head around how to truly express how I feel about the recent news. And to be honest, my initial thought was that I am mentally tired. It's mentally tiring and draining to hear how innocent people who look just like me are being murdered. For example, George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery, just to name a few. I am tired of hearing how people who look like me are being falsely accused of crimes they did not commit, all because of a preconceived notion. This isn't new.
It was the video seen by millions, a woman wrongly accusing a 9-year-old boy of grabbing her in a store on camera. It turned out just to be his backpack. That woman confronting the boy and his mother, and now that mom and child are talking to ABC's Lindsay Davis.
Sexually assaulted by a child.
9-year-old Jeremiah Harvey was in a Brooklyn convenience store with his mother last week when Teresa Klein, who was dubbed on social media as Corner Store Carolyn, accused him of sexual assault and said she was calling the police.
When Yasmin Abuliman recorded the now viral video on her cell phone.
Why do I need to show you my ID?
This man, Adam Bloom, volunteered at the Winston-Salem neighborhood pool and asked to see her ID. He also called police. When officers arrived, Abuliman told them she felt unfairly targeted. Police verified her pool pass worked.
In New York City in the late 80s and early 90s, the case of the Central Park jogger was notorious. 4 black teenagers, 1 Latino teenager were charged and jailed for the crime. The gruesome case whipped up an unbelievable hysteria throughout the city. The media ginning up fears with headlines about wolf packs and roving gangs and wilding. But the 5 boys, ages 14 to 16, had falsely confessed to the crime after hours of police interrogations.
Quite frankly, I am exhausted. I am exhausted about having to talk about race and justify why Black Lives Matter is important. This is my and many other people's daily reality. I have accepted that I will always be tired about fighting against racial injustice, but being tired will not stop me. I will always use my own experience, my platform, and my voice to educate those around me. As an educator, I strongly believe I have an impact on the younger generation, as these are the voices that will one day change history, so why not start now? All I ask is that after listening to this podcast, forward this to your friends, parents, members of your family. After all, we are not growing if we are not learning. So without further ado, let's get into it. It goes without saying that racism is not a good thing. And when you remove all the complexities that come with it and strip it down to its core, you really realise how ridiculous it is. So to break it down, I have come up with a basic analogy to prove how nonsensical racism is. And this is not to undermine the severity of its effects, it's just to help understand how it works. Imagine you have 2 t-shirts. Both t-shirts are manufactured in the same factory and made up of exactly the same materials, 50% cotton and 50% polyester. The only difference between the 2 t-shirts is that one t-shirt is black and the other t-shirt is white. I think we can all agree that it would be very silly to refuse to wear the black t-shirt purely on the basis that it's black. Now, let's think about how the t-shirts may have been marketed. The white t-shirt is described as good quality, long-lasting, presentable, and then the black t-shirt is described as poor quality, unpresentable and cheap. Imagine that this marketing message has been delivered to a large number of people for many, many years. Naturally, over time, the black t-shirt will develop a negative reputation and the white t-shirt will develop a positive reputation, even though they're both essentially the same. But based on what you have been told, you will now feel justified in your decision not to wear the black t-shirt and to choose the white t-shirt instead. Now swap the t-shirts for people, then think about the negative reputations that black people have developed over the many years, and think about where do these reputations come from. For example, the press and mass media have a huge impact in this by the way they portray black people, from the photos that they use to the language that that is used to describe them. Without realizing, many people subconsciously internalize these ideas and use it to make decisions on how they interact with Black people. This can lead to having a subconscious racial bias, which starts to develop from a young age. This was confirmed in a study carried out by Professor Margaret Beale Spencer and was based on a landmark doll test by Kenneth and Mamie Clark. The results showed that children associated negative attributes, such as being bad or being ugly, with darker skin, and positive attributes, such as being good and being pretty, were associated with lighter skin. Having a racial bias and not confronting it can lead to severe consequences, as can be seen in the news today. For example, George Floyd. By now we all know his name. This man was unfortunately killed while under the arrest due to one of the officers kneeling on his neck for over 8 minutes, even though he stated he could not breathe many times. Then there's Ahmaud Arbery. He was a 25-year-old African-American man who was shot dead all because he was jogging in a suburban area. The two men that shot him assumed that he was a criminal who was on their street to commit a crime, and that he should not have been jogging in the area in the first place. Then there's Christian Cooper. Christian Cooper could have had the same ending as George Floyd after his interaction with Amy Cooper of no relation. She was walking her dog in Central Park in an area where the dog was supposed to be on a leash. She was approached and asked by Christian Cooper, an African-American man, to please put her dog on a leash.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life. I'm sorry, I'm in the ramble, and there is a man, African-American, he has a bicycle helmet. He is recording me and threatening me and my dog. There is an African-American man, I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog.
In this clip, you can see her calling the police and repeatedly stating that she was being threatened, even though the video shows otherwise. This is where Amy exposes her own negative racial bias towards Black people. She says, "I'm going to call the cops and tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life," and then continues to do so. Two things stand out about this situation. The first being that she was obviously lying. She was not being threatened. She was simply being asked to abide by the rules of the park. The second is that she was willing to call the police on an innocent man. She knew exactly what she was doing by highlighting that he was an African-American man. Whether this was conscious or subconscious, she was taking advantage of the negative reputations of African-American men and was hoping it would work in her favour. After being exposed, Amy has later come forward and apologised and stated she is not racist. After all, she voted for Obama. Unfortunately, we live in a world of Amy Coopers. People who generally believe they are not racist, but when put in a situation where they lose control, those internalized racial biases come out. For example, being scared when you see a group of Black boys and then crossing the road. Black people being followed by security guards when they enter a store. Children, teenagers and adults with their interracial banter, usually resulting in a racial slur being used. And finally, footballers and football fans. There have been many reports of racism on the football pitch. So now you're probably thinking, Miss Sesay, what can I do? I'm not racist. I support Black Lives Matter. I put up the black square to show I care. How can I help in a situation like this? Well, let's start off with this phrase, I am not racist. To me, this is a basic expectation. The aim now is to be anti-racist. This is the conscious decision to identify and challenge racism on a daily basis. Anti-racism requires ongoing self-awareness and self-reflection as we move through life. So I'm going to give you some ways in which you can become an ally in this fight against racial injustice. Race is not an easy topic to discuss, and if you do feel uncomfortable or uneasy or even defensive about what I've said and what I'm about to say, I just want you to try and think why. Okay, so first of all, we need to start to recognize racial bias. Change happens first with oneself, so we need to identify if we are carrying our own internalized racial bias, and this is for everyone regardless of race. If so, we have to identify where this bias has come from. A lot of racial bias comes out of ignorance based on what we have been told, seen, or heard in mass media or in everyday society. It does not come from real life experiences. So individually, Firstly, each one of us needs to educate ourselves and unlearn any negative racial biases we have internalized. Secondly, we need to start to challenge racial microaggressions. Racism has a new face these days. It's not as direct as it used to be. It's subtle and sometimes disguised, which makes it hard to identify. So usually it could be in the form of just a joke or casual racism. These are known as racial microaggressions, daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental embarrassments, whether intentional or unintentional, communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults to target a person or a group. Microaggressions can be displayed in three forms, the first being microassaults. This form of microaggression is easier to recognize as it's characterized by verbal or non-verbal attacks meant to hurt the victim through name-calling or discriminatory actions, for example, describing a black person as coloured, blackie, or using the N-word. The second type of microaggressions are microinsults. These are probably the most common form of microaggressions. They are displayed through verbal and non-verbal communications that can be insensitive and degrading to a person's racial heritage or identity. They can be subtle and the perpetrator may not realize they are doing it. For example, the negative connotations of monkeys with black people, touching a black person's hair without permission, mimicking foreign accents as a joke, using phrases like "you're black, but you're not black," and then asking someone where they come from and then not being satisfied with their initial answer and then asking where they really come from. And then the third type of microaggression is micro-invalidation. This is characterized by communications that discredit the thoughts, feelings, and reality of a person of color. For example, "I don't see race," or "don't be oversensitive" in response to discussing a situation about race. And then finally, "you're just playing the race card." The key is, when you notice microaggressions occurring, challenge the person who is carrying it out. And then another thing you can do to help you become an ally is expand your knowledge. Listening to this podcast is a first step. More can be done. Do not rely on your black friends or other friends of different ethnicities to be the ones to have to educate you on topics of race. While we may have shared experiences, they are not all the same. There are books, videos, and a lot of information out there to help you become the best ally that you can be. So remember, you have a voice and you should always try to use it to deliver the right message. So what else can you do? There are lists of charities which you can donate to, and there are a number of petitions that you can sign to help improve the justice system and further support families that have fallen victims of racial injustice. So what is my message? If you ask me, it's pretty simple. Don't be discriminative. Don't be prejudiced. Don't make racist statements. Don't be racist. And finally, don't be afraid to speak out against racism. Why? Because Sesay says so.